Okay, I believe we are live. Hello and welcome to day 2 of our SAT crash course on writing grammar. I am Erica and thanks for joining us again. Before we get started, let me know in the YouTube chat, can you see me? Can you hear me? And can you see our slideshow? I'm going to just hang out until we get some confirmation in the chat and then we'll go ahead and get started. All right, looks like we are good to go. Thank you so much for being here. Let me know in the chat, are you joining us for day 2 or did you not attend yesterday and you're just coming in totally blind? If so, that's totally okay. Just let me know in the chat, are you rejoining us or is this your first day with us? So welcome to our SAT crash course on writing grammar. Like I mentioned, this is day 2. We'll go over really quickly what we talked about on day 1, and then we'll go ahead and jump right in. So before we do that, just want to introduce myself. Okay, cool. Looks like most folks are rejoining for day 2. That's awesome. It looks like we might have a smaller group today, which is great. It just means a lot of interaction in the chat. So hello again, I'm Erica. Reminder, I'm the SAT ACT Senior Curriculum Manager here at Magoosh. So what that means is that I work on the lessons, the questions, the video explanations, the blah, 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 all of that stuff, our live classes curriculum, our crash course curriculum, all of that. So if you have any feedback on that, leave that in the chat, leave that in our survey, which Milton is going to be linking in the chat. We've got Milton in the chat today. Say hi to Milton. Milton's great. And Milton's going to be sharing a survey with you all where you can get a gift card, but where you can also leave us feedback. Milton's also going to be answering some of your questions as they come in. So feel free to throw questions in the chat. But to kind of come back to this, I am the Senior Curriculum Manager at Magoosh, but I've also taught and written materials for more than 10 different standardized tests over the years. So standardized tests are kind of my life. SAT and ACT are where I started. They're where I keep coming back. I love them. And I live in Seattle, Washington with my husband and my 2 cats, Roz and Mal. They're great, but the door is closed, so they're not going to make any surprise appearances today. Hopefully. All right. So our goals. So we talked about these yesterday, but I want to just go over them one more time. We already learned SAT writing section structure and strategy. So we learned the timing for the section. We learned the passage structure. We learned the question structure. We learned that there's 2 different types of questions on the writing section, grammar and rhetoric. And we learned that we approach them differently. And then in this particular crash course, we are talking about grammar questions where we use the answer choices to our advantage to figure out what the questions are testing. So we covered all of that. That's done. What we started getting into last time is reviewing major grammatical concepts that are tested on the SAT. So last time we covered sentence structure and modifiers, which are super critical to being able to break down any type of grammar question on SAT writing, but also just are really common questions in and of themselves. But we didn't finish. We have more grammatical concepts to go through today. That's what we're doing. We are also exploring how these topics are tested on the SAT. So in our last class, we did some questions on sentence structure and on modifiers. In this class, we're going to be doing questions that deal with sentence structure and modifiers, but also introduce new elements. And then throughout this whole thing, we are practicing SAT writing question strategy. So using that strategy of using the answers to our advantage to figure out what's being tested, to figure out what sorts of rules we need to keep in mind, what sorts of things we should be looking out for, yada, yada, yada. So we've started on these last 3 bullets. We're going to continue on these last 3 bullets today. Now, as a reminder, part of the cool thing about this crash course is that we also have a code that we are offering to the viewers of this crash course, which is SAT Crash 20, and it is good for 20% off any ACT or SAT plan with Magoosh. So that's our online program, that's our live classes, all of that. So if you like what we're doing in here today and you're going, wow, I would really like more of this. Maybe I'd really like more practice questions. Maybe I want more live instruction. Maybe I really like this format, whatever. If you feel that way, we have a lot more stuff at Magoosh. We've got a lot of practice questions. We've got a lot more live content. So if you are interested, I highly recommend using this code to try it out and see if it works for you. So SAT Crash 20, I'm going to show that again at the end of our presentation. But as a reminder, this will be available for you to use for the next few days. All right. One other thing that is not on this slide, we are raffling off a 1-month SAT Magoosh subscription. So if you would like to be entered into that raffle, you've got a pretty good shot if we don't have a ton more folks show up. So just stick around to the end when we do that raffle. We are giving away another one. We gave one away last time, got another one today. So stick around and maybe you'll get lucky. All right. So let's go ahead and jump in with SAT writing grammar. So like I mentioned last time, we talked about sentence structure and modifiers. Those are pretty dense topics, right? There was a lot in there. So we talked about what makes up a complete sentence. We talked about what modifiers are, which is fluff, detail, description. Talked about how we can cut those out of the sentence to simplify sentences and make it easier to notice other errors, whether they're sentence structure or maybe some of the things we're going to talk about today. But we also talked about how modifiers can be tested in and of themselves, and that they've got to be punctuated properly with commas or without commas, and that they need to be properly placed, ideally next to the thing that they describe. So we dealt with kind of the meaning issues with modifiers. Today, we are going to talk about some new grammar topics while bringing in some of the stuff we already know about sentence structure and modifiers. So we're going to talk about punctuation to start, which kind of builds on what we know about sentence structure. We're going to talk about parallelism, which is another sentence structure related topic. Then we're going to get into some of the other ones that might be a little bit more familiar, but less complicated, perhaps, when dealing with tense, agreement, possessives, and finally idioms. So got a lot to get through today. Let's get started. Okay. Oh, and yes, Milton just mentioned in the chat, feel free to post any questions here during the presentation. Yeah, if you have questions as things come up, throw those in the chat. I'm also going to be asking for a lot of participation through polls as well as in the chat. So please be ready to participate. Okay. Let's start with punctuation. So punctuation is basically the best friend of sentence structure, right? When we have a sentence, we need to punctuate that sentence to indicate that it is a sentence. When we have something that's not a sentence, we need to punctuate it to indicate that it's not a sentence. So that means that we often build on our understanding of sentence structure with punctuation. However, we can't do that if we don't know the rules of punctuation. So this slide is going to be focused on all of the rules that you have to know, like memorize. You have to have these down and know how to apply them, or you're going to struggle with these questions. So a lot of memorization coming up on this slide. Let's start from the top. So our first piece of punctuation is hopefully the easiest one, and that is the period. And a period is used to separate independent clauses, to conclude independent clauses. So as a reminder from yesterday, an independent clause is just another fancy word for a complete sentence, something that can stand on its own as a complete sentence. So if you have a period at the end of something, it must be a complete sentence. That's it. Hopefully there's no questions on that rule, because this is one that we're using a lot. But again, this is something that you will likely see with a sentence structure question of evaluating, okay, is this actually a sentence? Let's get into commas. Now, commas are also pretty familiar. We use them around with the same frequency that we use periods. However, commas are used for a lot more stuff. So let's talk about the different things that we use commas for. Now, these first three rules are the same rules that we talked about with our modifiers. So we talked about how when we have modifiers, we need to separate those modifiers from the complete sentence with a comma. So I'm going to go ahead and annotate just to draw what we drew before. So we went, okay, if there is a modifier right here at the beginning, we have to put a comma before the rest of our sentence. If there is a modifier right here at the end, we have to put a comma before it to separate it from the rest of the sentence. If we've got a modifier shoved in the middle of a sentence, we need to put a comma both before and after And then we've got the rest of the sentence or the complete sentence on the outside. And then the idea there is that if we cut out the modifier piece that is set off with commas, we should be left with an independent clause or a complete sentence, right? Now, modifiers aren't necessarily the only things that can be set off with commas, but the big thing to know here is that if we are setting something off from the sentence, the piece that we are setting off cannot be an independent clause, right? It has to be like a modifier, so a descriptive phrase or a dependent clause, something that cannot stand on its own as a sentence. And then the other part has to be an independent clause. We have to have a complete sentence in there somewhere, but the other piece that we're setting off cannot be a complete sentence. So as an example, this first rule, if we have an independent clause and then a comma, this piece right here should not be an independent clause. So that's this example right here, where we have maybe a modifier at the end set off with a comma. The rest should be an independent clause. Then we got this one right here. We've got our modifier at the beginning, or our other thing that's not an independent clause set off with a comma. And we have an independent clause, something that is complete. So that's this example right here. And then this one's kind of funny, so stay with me. If we've got a modifier or something that's not an independent clause shoved in the middle of the sentence, we've got commas on either side. If we were to take this part out of the sentence, we should have two pieces that when we put them together makes an independent clause. Go ahead and give me a face in the chat on whether we understand that. So give me a smiley face if you're like, yes, I understand this rule. If I take out that part in the middle that's not an independent clause, the two pieces on the outside come together to make an independent clause. So give me a smiley face if you're like, I get it. Give me a sideways face if you're like, I don't know. And then give me a frowny face if you're like, what are you talking about? I'm totally, totally lost. And again, visual representation of that right here. If we take out this chunk that's set off with commas, these two pieces should come together to make an independent clause. Okay, it looks like we're solid. And I did see a question, which was, are modifiers always set off with commas? So that's something that we covered last time, but that's a really great question. No, not always. So modifiers are set off with commas if they are not necessary to the meaning of the sentence. They're extra information. They will not have commas if they are necessary to the meaning of the sentence. That's required information. So required to understand it. The rule here is kind of if you do have those commas and they are setting off a modifier or just an extra piece of information. So if you do have those two commas, if you take out what's set off by the commas, you should have an independent clause. So right here, we should be able to take out this part, independent clause, take out this part, independent clause. Here, take out this part, independent clause. All right, so those are our kind of modifier or just extra information comma rules. But we can also use commas for other things. So let's talk about those. Who here knows what a fanboys is? Is that a term that is familiar to you? Fanboys, and I'll give you a hint. It is what's the word for it? Not initialism. It's I can't remember what that's called. Abbreviation? No, that's not right. It's one of those things where the initials spell something out. Okay, it stands for, and I'm going to tell you because I'm getting lost in the sauce here. It's called for, and, nor, but, or, yet. So acronym. Thank you. Holy moly, my brain was just turned off there. But it's a great question. It's not quite a preposition. It's very similar to a preposition, but these are actually called coordinating conjunctions. You don't need to know that term, but this is an acronym for these coordinating conjunctions. And these coordinating conjunctions are things that we use in the sentence to link ideas. So I'm just gonna type those out really quickly. For, and, nor, but, or, yet. So, okay. Now, we can use for, and, nor, but, or, yet, so in sentences, even when we are linking two things that aren't independent clauses. However, if we have two independent clauses and we want to put them together in the same sentence with a comma, we need to use a comma and a fanboys. We need to have both pieces. So as an example. I went to the store and I went to the mall. I went to the store, independent clause. I went to the mall, independent clause. Because I have two of them, I need to separate them with both a comma and my fanboys. So I went to the store and I went to the mall, or I went to the store or I went to the mall, or I went to the store, but I went to the mall. And I need to have a comma in there in all of those cases. Now, what we can't do is connect those two independent clauses without a comma, with just a fanboys. That's illegal. We also cannot connect it with just a comma. So if I have an independent clause, a comma, and then another independent clause. So for example, I went to the store, comma, I went to the mall. That's what's called a comma splice. It is a type of run-on. They love this one in wrong answers. Do not do that. That is such a common wrong answer, not allowed. So watch out for comma splices. You need a comma and a fanboys. Now, like I said, you can use fanboys even when you're not connecting to independent clauses. So for example, I went to the store and the mall. So the mall is not an independent clause. That's fine. I can still use and. I just wouldn't put a comma before it. So I went to the store and I went to the mall has no punctuation, but I went to the store and I went to the mall would have a comma before the and. Hopefully that's tracking for everybody. Let me know if you have any questions on that in the chat. But moral of the story, two independent clauses, comma, plus a fanboys. Now, there are other uses for commas, but the last one that I want to talk about that's particularly common and that actually plays into parallelism, which we're going to talk about next, is that when we have a 3 or more item list, we're going to use commas to separate each item. So if we have 1, 2, and 3, we're going to put a comma between each one. Now, I want to note something. This comma right here before the and is something that's called an Oxford comma. It is technically not required grammatically. It's one of those things where some people like it, some people don't. However, this test is always going to use the Oxford comma, but they're never going to test you on it. So just know they always will have a comma before the and in a list of 3 or more items, but they're never going to ask you about it. They're never going to test you on it. It's just going to show up. So moral of the story, when you have a list on the SAT, commas between each one. Awesome. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and just clear this because that's a lot of stuff going on here. Hopefully we're solid with commas. So those are the main uses of commas that we should know. Let's get into the weird ones. Let's talk about semicolons. So the thing that I want you to know about semicolons is that semicolons work the same way that periods do. So it separates two independent clauses. Semicolons also separate two independent clauses. That's it. That's all you need to know. Now, some folks get really hung up on the fact that with independent clauses, it's that are separated with semicolons, it's really important that they're related, that they have similar ideas. And I'm here to tell you that they are never going to test you on the meaning of a semicolon. That's just not a thing. They will exclusively test you on the grammar of a semicolon. So what that means is that they're never going to give you two answer choices where one's a period and one's a semicolon and there's no other difference. They're going, which one is better? That's not a thing. If you see two answer choices where one has a period and one has a semicolon, those are grammatically identical and they are both wrong, because you can't have two right answers. So moral of the story, when you see a semicolon, you should have an independent clause before it and an independent clause after. That is the only rule you have to know for a semicolon. Okay. Let's go ahead and move on to our next rule. Next rule is a colon. So really quickly in the chat, I'd like you to tell me, what do you think the rule is for a colon, or when do you think you should use a colon? In the chat, ignore what I have on the slide. When do you think you should use a colon? And I usually get the same answer from most students, so I want to see what you have to say. When do you think of using a colon? That's the 2 dots. And so far, the answers I'm getting align with what I normally see from my students. I'm seeing a list, a list, a list. I'm seeing a couple other things, but the big one I'm seeing is we use semicolons for a list, or maybe when I'm describing something briefly, adding more information. And I'm here to tell you that yes, you can use colons to set off a list or to set off extra information, but that's not the rule for a colon. Because the rule for a colon is not really about the meaning, it's about the grammar. The rule for colons is that you have to have an independent clause before your colon. After that, you can have pretty much anything you want. It can be a list, it can be a word, it can be another independent clause, it can be a dependent clause, it can be a phrase, it can be a modifier, whatever, but it has to have an independent clause beforehand. So for instance, I'm seeing a couple of examples in the chat and some of them are right and some of them are wrong. So I'm going to shout them out. So I'm seeing one, I have an idea, colon, we must study. That is fine because we have, I have an idea, a complete sentence before the colon. Now there's another example in here that isn't right. And that's not a problem that it's not right because a lot of people do this, but it won't be right on this test. So for instance, the beautiful show, colon, Bob the Builder would not be correct because the beautiful show is, and also a very funny example, the beautiful show is not a complete sentence. Right? So that would not be okay. It might be something we'd see in like a title, right? But it wouldn't be something we'd see in a complete sentence. So it would not be okay on the SAT. Cool. Let me give you another example because this is really, really important. So on our camping trip, I am bringing, colon, graham crackers, chocolate, and marshmallows. That is wrong. Wrong, not okay, because on our camping trip, I am bringing is not a sentence. I am bringing what? Right? So what we would need to do is complete the sentence before the colon. So on our camping trip, I am bringing the following ingredients. Okay, now that is okay because now we have an independent clause before our colon. Now, again, I could put pretty much anything I want after this colon. Again, one word, another independent clause, a dependent clause, a phrase, a list, whatever. But the big rule is it has to be an independent clause beforehand. So I'm seeing another example on our camping trip, the stuff I am bringing are, that would also not work because if you just take that out, the stuff I am bringing are what? That's not a complete sentence, right? So you could say the stuff I am bringing are the following items. That's a complete thought. Then we put a colon, so that's allowed. So big idea is if you take out everything after the colon, you should be left with a complete sentence. Cool? Does that make sense to everybody? So colon, forget everything you know. It's wrong. I don't know why there are so many misconceptions around colons, but I know I had the wrong idea about them as well. Cut out the stuff after the colon. It should be a complete sentence beforehand. Okay, that's colon. Make sure you memorize that one. A lot of people don't know that. Oh, I've got another one. Each component is vital to the sustainability of, colon, also not right, because you wouldn't end a sentence with an of, right? That would not be okay. So again, it's something that we do in real life and that no one cares about in real life, but on this test, it would be wrong. It would have to be each component is vital to the sustainability of, and here I would just actually just cut the colon, the others, and to the system of as a whole. There's some parallelism issues there, but I would just cut the colon there and not have it. Or you could do the sustainability of these two things, colon. That would be fine. Hopefully that makes sense. Again, a really commonly misunderstood rule. We'll see an example of this shortly. Okay. Last one, last rule that we got to know for punctuation is dash. Now there are two possible uses for a dash. All right. So let's talk about the first one. So the first one is the most commonly understood use of a dash, which is where we have two dashes, right? Dash number 1 and dash number 2. Now this works almost exactly like two commas, right? Where if we have two commas and they set off something that's not a complete sentence from the rest of the sentence, we can just pull it out of the sentence and we have an independent clause left. Same deal with two dashes. If we've got two dashes, we should be able to, whoops, stop that. We should be able to just cut out what's between those two dashes and have an independent clause left. So cut out what's between the dashes, you should have a complete sentence. That is the rule. Now, the only real difference here is that with two commas, it has to be that the stuff in between the commas is not a complete sentence. However, in this example, we could technically have a complete sentence between the dashes. We can kind of have anything, right? But again, the big rule, two dashes, cut out what's between them, you should have a complete sentence left over. Okay. Then over here, we've got our second rule for independent clauses, which is what if we only have, our second rule for dashes, what if we only have one dash? So if we've got a single dash, the rule is the same as a colon. So when we've got a colon, everything before the colon should be an independent clause. When we've got a single dash, everything before that single dash should be an independent clause. So if we cut the stuff after the colon, it's an independent clause. If we cut the stuff after our single dash, it's an independent clause. So a lot of people think that you need two dashes in a sentence for that to work. That's not true, because you could be dealing with that second rule where you only have a dash and it's working the same way as a colon. So two dashes works like two commas, one dash works like a colon. Whew. And that's all of our rules for punctuation that you absolutely have to memorize. So I'm going to clear this slide really quickly. And if you want to take like a screenshot, I would recommend this so that you can come back to this later. But again, this is going to be posted on YouTube if you want to review these rules. Okay, I have one question, another example. So here, technically, that would fit that rule of each component is vital. That is an independent clause before that colon. But here, I just wouldn't have a colon. You can get away without it because, yeah, technically you could, but you just don't need that punctuation there because you just have a pretty simple prepositional modifier afterward. I would just cut the colon, just no colon. It's easier that way. A good rule of thumb is if you don't need the punctuation, don't add it. This is a rule that we're going to talk a little bit more later about, but it's kind of this idea of keep it simple. Keep it simple. So there, keep it simple. I would not do punctuation at all. Okay. Now that we've got that, what can we learn from everything we just talked about here? Rules are better than your ear. Because so frequently with the writing section in particular, students go in and they're like, I know how English works. I've spoken it for a long time. I've written a lot of English. I've read a lot of English. I got it, right? But as we learned from like our colon rule, oftentimes we don't really know how punctuation is used, or it's used wrong in everyday life and it won't work on this test. So when you're going through the writing section, rather than going like, yeah, that feels good, I like that, instead go to the rules, memorize those rules, have those locked in and use them as opposed to what feels good. All right. So a couple of tips, and I'm seeing a couple other questions. I'll come back to those in just 1 second. Sounds right is a dangerous game. Don't do that. They are building in answers that fit those rules we think we know or that sound right or look right. No, use the rules. The test makers build in those answers on purpose. And then the SAT tests a limited set of grammar rules. So what that means is that we can memorize pretty much everything on the test in advance. You don't have to know weird rules that go outside of, say, what was on the previous page. You just got to know these ones so we can be prepared to go in. They're not going to test anything other than that. Okay, to come back to a couple of other questions, if we are given a dash and a colon, which one do we choose? They will never ask you to do that. So a dash and a colon are grammatically identical the way that a period and a semicolon are grammatically identical. They will never, 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 ever ask you to do that. And if they do, they're both wrong because they're the same. All right. And then another question, how do we use the M dash on the SAT? That was on the previous slide. So I'd recommend going back and watching that after that's posted. When I say dash, I mean M dash. It's the same thing. Okay, great. Anything else? So again, with the writing section, this is all multiple choice. We talked about that last time. This is not the essay section. Those are different. So this is all multiple choice. And we're going to see an example of how this will be tested in just 1 second. Okay. So punctuation, we've got periods, commas, semicolons, colons, dashes, a lot of stuff going on. Tips here, you can recognize these by seeing that the punctuation changes between answer choices. So the clue is pretty obvious here. If you see the punctuation change, likely the punctuation is being tested. Know the real rules. Many think they know these rules, but they actually don't. Come back, watch this again. If you want to learn the rules, you have to know. And then, like I mentioned before, sentence structure informs punctuation. We need to be able to identify independent clauses in order to get these right. So if we're trying to figure out what punctuation to use, typically the question we're asking is this an independent clause? And that will tell us what sort of punctuation we want to use. Okay, now that we've covered that, let's try a question. Now I want to start this one together because I want to just kind of do a refresher of what we're doing when we see these questions. So the first thing I'm going to be doing is I am going to be looking at this sentence right here and going, holy moly, this is a long, long, long sentence. Okay, it's got a lot of punctuation. It's got 1, 2, 3, 4 commas. When we've got a sentence this long and with this many commas, we might want to use that strategy of cutting the fluff, of getting rid of modifiers, getting rid of extra information to simplify the sentence down and make it easier to understand. So I'm going in knowing this might be a good candidate for cutting the fluff. It might also be an example of some sentence structure issues, but we know sentence structure and punctuation go hand in hand. So looking at my answer choices, what are the differences? Just punctuation. So here we have 2 commas. Okay, so A is 2 commas. B is, okay, just 1 comma. So missing something right here. Here we've got a semicolon and a comma. Here we've got a colon and then nothing. Okay, so we're going, all right, we've got a punctuation question. We're dealing with some sentence structure stuff. I'm going to be trying to identify, do I have independent clauses here to figure out what sort of punctuation I want to use? Go ahead and give this one a shot. I recommend, again, cutting the fluff if you're not sure what's a sentence and what isn't. So go ahead and answer either in the chat or in the poll. Do you think the answer is A, B, C, or D? Take about 40 seconds with this one. Good luck. And then we've got a poll open. So if you can answer in the poll, recommend that one. And again, if you're having a hard time, try cutting the fluff. Okay, all right. It's looking like the most popular answer is correct. The correct answer is, in fact, C, but let's walk through why C is the correct answer. So first thing I'm going to do is go, again, this is a really long sentence, so I'm going to cut some of the stuff out of it. I'm going to just get rid of it. So first things first, thus, the transition word, don't care, gone. Oops. Thus, gone. On the one hand, prepositional phrase, gone. This is being so goofy. Gone. The Oxfordians' denial of Shakespeare's literacy, prepositional phrase, gone. Makes is a verb, arguments, okay? From lack of information is another prepositional phrase, gone. So far I have the Oxfordians' denial makes arguments. On the other, another prepositional phrase, the Stratfordians' argument, okay, rests, verb, on the reports of people. So prepositional phrase, who knew Shakespeare personally, relative clause, all modifiers, gone, 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 gone. So rewriting this as a shorter sentence, we've got the Oxfordians' denial makes arguments, comma, the Stratfordians' argument rests. Okay, now I'm going to go ahead and just take out, for the time being, on the other, just taking that out. So we're only going to consider the piece of punctuation that's separating those two pieces. So in this first one, a comma, in the second one, nothing. In C, a semicolon. In D, a colon. Now, taking a look here, the Oxfordians' denial makes arguments. That's an independent clause. Denial makes arguments. Denial, noun, makes verb, arguments, complete thought. Great, we've got one independent clause here. The Stratfordians' argument rests. Argument, noun, rests, verb. And it's a complete thought. The argument rests. Cool. Okay, so we have an independent clause and another independent clause separated by exclusively a comma. That is illegal. It's a comma splice. I cannot have it. B is even worse. It has no punctuation at all. That's another run-on that is gone. Now C versus D. In C, we have a semicolon. That's allowed. Two independent clauses separated by a semicolon is cool. D has a colon. But remember, with a colon, we can have an independent clause before a colon and then anything else afterwards. So it's also fine with D. So what makes C right over D? I'm seeing that D was our second most popular answer, but we had a lot more folks, more than 3 times the number of folks picking C. And that's because of this sneaky little comma right here. So here we have to consider this phrase on the other that we cut out. All right. On the other is a prepositional phrase, so a modifier at the beginning of a sentence. Oh, oftentimes we set off modifiers at the beginning of sentences with commas. Now, if we're not sure, we can take a look at the previous sentence. And on the previous sentence, we have on the one hand. And if we see this on the one hand, I don't know why this is right here. Go away. Okay, on the one hand, we see that it has a comma after it. On the other, mirrors that, has a comma after it. Okay, so we want to make those two match. They're both set off with commas. We want the comma, and thus the answer is C. Now, again, I want to note that if D had a comma, that would also be a possible correct answer. So they would never do that because, again, a colon or a semicolon would work fine here. So the reason D is wrong is that it doesn't have a comma here, and that makes C correct. Whew. Ooh, so this does have an element of parallelism, which leads us into our next question type. But the big thing to note here is that with punctuation, it goes hand in hand with what we know about sentence structure and what we know about modifiers from last time. So you have to have that foundation that we went over last time in order to get these questions right. Okay, nice work. And we're good to go. All right, so that's punctuation in a nutshell. I really recommend practicing more problems and going back and reviewing those rules to make sure they're rock solid. So we're gonna go ahead and move on to parallelism. So like we saw in that example, we had on the one hand and then on the other, and those have the same structure, right? They both start with on, they're both prepositional phrases. And we saw that because they're so similar, they were punctuated similarly. That's what's going on with parallelism. So parallelism, if we think about parallel lines, they're lines that are doing the same thing, have the same slope, they're just in different places. Parallel structure is the idea that there are 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 pieces of a sentence that are doing the same thing. They have the same grammatical structure, just in 2 or 3 or 4 different places. Now, the most common place that we see parallelism is in list items. When we have a list, every item in that list must match grammatically. So an example here, I like basketball, soccer, and to play golf. Now that should sound weird to you, right? Because we go, I like basketball, a noun, soccer, a noun, and to play golf, an infinitive. That's not right because those list items don't match. So a really easy way to fix this is to just get rid of the to play. And then we have I like basketball, soccer, and golf, 3 nouns. Now we can also make parallelism in other ways. We could go, I like to play basketball, to play soccer, and to play golf, 3 infinitives. I like to play basketball, play soccer, and play golf, 3 verbs. I like playing basketball, playing soccer, and playing golf, 3 INGs. The big idea, though, is that they have to match. So I'm seeing a comment in the chat. I feel like playing golf would work too. It would probably work best if we had playing basketball, playing soccer, and playing golf, because there, all 3 of them have that ING so that they match. But here we'd probably want basketball the sport, soccer the sport, golf the sport. That makes sense. So the idea with parallelism is we can make it in a lot of ways, but if we have a list, we need to make sure they all match. Okay, so tips. Look for and, because and is the word that we get when we have lists. So if you see and, look for your list and then look for parallelism within that list. That is the most common thing that will be tested when you have a list. Now, that said, there are other structures that will have parallelism. They're not as common, but you should be on the lookout for them because if you see them, guarantee they're testing parallelism. So as an example, oh, and Rachel, that also works. I like to play basketball, soccer, and golf, also totally fine. I like to play basketball, soccer, and golf. Yep, that also totally works. So again, lots of ways to form it. So some other examples of how we might see parallelism, not only X, but also Y. So if you see a not only, but also, the thing after the not only has to perfectly match the thing after the but also. So if X is a noun, Y has to be a noun. If X is a prepositional phrase, Y has to be a prepositional phrase. If X is an ING, Y has to be an ING, and so on and so forth. You might also see both X and Y. Notice the and, right? So this is a list of 2 things. The X must match the Y, both nouns, both verbs, both infinitives, whatever. Either X or Y. So again, we have a fan voice with or. The thing after the either must match the thing after the or. Both nouns, both verbs, both INGs, whatever. And then finally, neither X nor Y. If you see any of those structures, the clue is look at the thing after the either or the neither or the both, and it has to match the thing after the or the nor or the and. Okay. So let's go ahead and give this a shot in a kind of tricky but classic parallelism question. Okay, I'd like you to go ahead and take a look at this sentence and then tell me what word you notice, what clue word jumps out in the sentence and says, hello, this is parallelism. This is not a trick question. Hopefully the answer should be pretty clear based on the last slide. What word jumps out in this sentence as a clue that we might have parallelism? Yeah, we should see the and the and should go, hello, this is a list. And I'm seeing a couple of folks coming in with maybe an answer or maybe a clue for the answer. I like where your head's at, but I'm seeing an and here, and that and says, hello, there's a list going on in this sentence. Okay, so what I'd like you to do is to figure out what are the list items. And then based on that, what do you think the correct answer is? Go ahead and answer in the chat or in the poll, A, B, C, or D, based on what you think the correct answer is. All right, and go ahead and answer in the poll if you think you've got it. You may notice that this is kind of a long, nasty sentence. Maybe consider cutting the fluff to make those list items more obvious. Okay, this is looking really great. Now, if you're still working, you can still put your answer in, but the most popular answer by far is D, to track, which is correct, but let's talk about why that is. Okay, so the first thing I'm gonna do is maybe cut out a little bit of the fluff. So I'm going to get rid of over the last 15 years. I'm going to get rid of largely due to a few intrepid researchers. I'm going to get rid of maybe, no, I'm not going to get rid of anything else. Okay, so what I'm going to notice is that we've got the quest to identify destructive tornadoes, comma, tracking their paths, comma, and, oh, actually, I am going to get rid of if necessary, just to make my life a little bit easier, get rid of some commas, to alert residents. What I like to do when I've got lists is to just write the little list items out as bullets, just so I can kind of visually compare them or think about them in my head as bullets. So my last one after the and is, oops. My last one after the and is to alert residents. Okay, so that starts with a to, a preposition. Okay, interesting. Now, my list item before that, after the previous comma, is tracking their paths. Right away, I can see that tracking and to alert do not match, right? To alert is an infinitive or with a prepositional phrase with a to, and then tracking is an ing. So I don't like that, and I might be leaning toward an answer at this point. But going to the previous one, I see another to. So I'm pretty sure that my first list item should be to identify destructive tornadoes. Oops. Destructive. All right, we're just going to go to identify tornadoes. Okay. So I'm noticing that this should be a to, and I noticed that by looking at the thing after the and. So what do I see? I see that the answer choices are tracking, which we know is wrong. So I'm going to go ahead and just eliminate tracking. I see that B introduces another and, Why would I do that? So I'm going to go ahead and roll that one out. Nobody picked that one. Great job. Now, what I'm seeing is that the answers were split between track and two track, with twice the number of people picking two track, which is the right one, but still like about a third of folks picking track, which is a really tempting answer because we see alert, we see identify, both present tense verbs. So why not just track? Because of this little two, the one before alert. Because we've got a two before alert, we have to have a two before track. And that means that the answer has to be D. Now, if that little two was gone, then our list would be alert residents, track their paths, and identify tornadoes. And that would be fine. But because that little two is there, that means the answer has to be D. Okay, hopefully that helps. Perfect. Okay. And I'm seeing a quick general question about the writing section. Should we read the entire passage in advance? No, we talked about that last time. We're going to just answer the questions as we go. I recommend checking out yesterday's class just for that information at the beginning. Okay, so really nice job with parallelism. Look at your list items. If you need to write them out separately, do it, but they just have to match. So little words really matter here. Once again, we saw the benefit of cutting the fluff. All right. Let's move right along to tense. So dealing with parallelism is sentence structure, right? Making a sentence that's a real sentence. Dealing with punctuation is sentence structure, making a sentence that's a real sentence. Tense is a different thing because often with tense, the sentence is grammatically correct any different way. However, when we have a different tense in the sentence, it changes the meaning of the sentence. It changes the timeline of the sentence. It changes what events happen in what order. And that's what's going on here. So this is less about the structure of the sentence. Is it complete? And more about the meaning of the sentence. Does it make sense? Does this timeline work in context? So let's talk about how we deal with tense. So I'm assuming going into this slide that people have an understanding of past, present, and future. If you're confused about that, let me know in the chat, but I'm just going in with that assumption that past, present, and future were solid. Okay, so let's talk tips on tense. So a clue that we have a tense problem is that the verb tense changes between answers. Seems like it's pretty obvious, but once again, remember that ing and ed is not always a tense, right? That can sometimes be a different type of word, a noun or an adjective. So just watch out for that. We want to make sure that we are seeing an actual change in tense. All right. So if you see the verb tense change between answers, what we want to do is we want to look at other verbs in the sentence, because those other verbs in the sentence will have tenses, and we can look at those tenses and go, what sort of tense do I want with this verb? However, we also want to look for time words: after, before, during. Now, why does that matter? Well, because the tense between various verbs in the sentence and in surrounding sentences may not match. So sometimes we have a sentence and we have no time words. Usually in that case, we're going to take the verb in the sentence and match it to our verb. They should be the same. Question done. Amazing. But if we have a time word like after, before, during, that might indicate that those two verbs actually have different tenses, and we need to use that time word to figure out what tense we want this word to be in. So time words usually don't have a tense themselves, but they indicate that we want to change tense during the sentence. So as an example, I ate before coming to the party. So coming to the party, all right, whatever, but I ate before that. Or I was swimming when the phone rang. So I was swimming when that happened. It's going during that other event. So see how those two tenses don't match, but we've got that word during to tell us, or that word before to tell us. Now, a really common tense to use when we have these time words is our perfect tense. Who here has taken a language in school and has maybe learned about perfect tenses in that language they've learned? So maybe you've learned like Spanish, maybe you've learned, I think French also has a perfect tense. I don't know a lot of languages, but if you have learned a language in school, yeah, then you maybe know what a perfect tense is. Because if you are learning a language in school, that's something you learn. In English, they don't really teach you that often in English class. It's just something you're kind of expected to pick up, but we have one too. So perfect tense in any language is a tense that is the relative past. It's saying it's the past of something. It happened before something else. All right. So what does that mean? Let's talk through some examples. So the most common one is past perfect. So the past of the past. So that's saying I have a past event, but I'm saying something happened before that past event. That's when I use past perfect. So past perfect is had plus the past participle, which is usually just the past tense of the verb. So the past perfect of study is had studied. The past tense of eat is had eaten. So see how that's sometimes not the past tense. It's sometimes a weird thing. It's called the past participle. The past tense of sleep, or the past participle of sleep, is had slept. All right. So an example of using the past participle, I'm going to write this on our little slideshow. I had studied Spanish for 5 years before I went to Spain. So here I went to Spain in the past, right? Past tense, went to Spain. But before that, I had studied Spanish for 5 years. Does that make sense? So past perfect is the past of the past. Now, I'm seeing in the chat, could it also be have? Yes, it can, but that's not past perfect. That is present perfect. That's has or have plus the past participle. And that's saying this has happened before the present. This has happened before now. I have eaten. So right now, I've already eaten. We're good. I have already studied Spanish for 5 years. So right now I've studied Spanish for 5 years. I might still study Spanish for 5 more years. I might study Spanish for no more years, but right at this moment, I have studied it for 5 years. So different tenses. So had is past perfect, past of the past. Has or have is present perfect, past of the present. And then we've got future perfect, which is kind of rare, which is will have plus the past participle, and that's the past of the future. So an example, I will have studied Spanish for 5 years before I go to Spain. So I'm going to go to Spain in the future, but I will have studied Spanish for 5 years before that. So maybe I haven't done 5 years yet, but by the time I go to Spain, I will have done it. Now, these are important to know because these are some of the weird ones, right? They're ones that we don't learn about in school. And so they come up a lot when we have, say, time words like before in this example sentence. So we need to know them for those weird cases where the tenses don't match. But what if we don't have a time word? What if we don't have any clues in the sentence? What if we think the tenses should just match? SAT writing strategy. Keep it simple, student. A lot of people use the phrase keep it simple, stupid, but I don't think you should call yourself stupid on the SAT. So keep it simple, student. The idea behind this rule is that if you don't need to do something fancy, don't do something fancy. So going back to our punctuation, we talked about the idea of don't add a colon if you don't need to. Don't add a comma if you don't need to. Keep punctuation minimal. If you've got punctuation, there has to be a reason. It's the same thing with fancy tenses. If you do not need a fancy answer, pick the boring answer. So do I really need past perfect, or does regular past work fine? Do I need present perfect, or does regular past work fine? Do I need continuous? I have been going to the mall, or I am being swimming. Do I need that? Probably not. You could just say, I'm swimming, or I like to swim, something that is much more simple. So do you need something fancy? Make sure that you have a time word or some sort of justification before you pick a fancy tense like a perfect tense. So do I really need this comma? Do I really need a fancy tense? And something that we see in our rhetoric questions, does my answer really need to be this long? Usually our best bet is pick less punctuation, simple tenses, and short answers, because this test likes things that are boring and they know students like to pick things that are fancy. So you should know your weird tenses like your perfect ones, but don't use them unless you need to. Give me a face on that concept. So smiley face if you're like, I get it. Keep it boring unless I've got a reason. But if I see a time word, I'm going to consider maybe using one of my interesting tenses like perfect. So smiley face if you've got it, sideways face if you're like, I need to practice this, frowny face if you're like, what are you talking about? I'm completely lost. All right. I'm seeing that we're maybe feeling good about this. Okay. Now, if you're going, I don't want to admit to this in the chat, but maybe I'm struggling, we're going to try an example. So example question, we're back with Bakila from last time. So go ahead and give this a read. What we should notice here is that the underlined portion is had included or past perfect. A verb tense. We see be included, C will include, D includes. Those are all different tenses. So pretty sure this is verb tense. So we're going to be looking around at the sentence to see if we see any other verbs, any sort of time words as clues. Remembering that if we don't have any clues, we should pick the boring answer. Keep it simple, student. All right, go ahead and answer A, B, C, or D in the chat or in the poll. There's a poll up, so go ahead and answer in the poll if you can. Take about 10 more seconds. Okay, we're gonna wrap this up because at 93%, we are picking B, and that is the correct answer. 94%, woo, really nice job. That is the correct answer. Why? Well, let's take a look. If I take a look at this sentence, and I'm just gonna look at the same sentence, I see the training was rigorous, past tense. Taking a look at the rest of the sentence, I don't see any time words in this sentence. The training was rigorous and had included. Okay, so I don't have any time words. I don't have any justification to change my tense. Well, let's take a look. Was rigorous is past, and had included is that fancy past perfect. So if I were to think about my timeline here I would have the training was rigorous. And then before that, it had the 20-mile runs. So it had 20-mile runs before it was rigorous. That doesn't make any sense, right? Those are happening at the same time. It was rigorous and it had 20-mile runs. Those are the same thing. They're related ideas. So there's no reason to get fancy with it. In fact, it doesn't make sense to say that it included 20-mile runs before it was rigorous. So it doesn't make sense to use this fancy tense. Will include puts it in the future. What? Includes puts it in the present. What? Keep it simple, student. Regular past to match. All right. Nice work. Let's go ahead and move along. I'm seeing a question about active and passive voice. Ask me again at the end of the lesson, but the short answer is that active and passive voice isn't really tested. It's kind of tested, but it's like at the very bottom. We can absolutely use passive voice in this test. It's not wrong. Okay, so the correct answer here is B, keep it simple, student. Okay, Let's move along to agreement. So agreement is the idea that the number of words needs to match. So thinking about tense, right? That's the idea that verbs have to be in the right time. Agreement is the idea that verbs, as well as nouns, as well as pronouns, have to be in the right number. So when we have a noun and a pronoun, we want to make sure that that noun and that pronoun agree so that they have the same number. We also want to do that with nouns and verbs. So we want to make sure that the nouns and the verbs have the same number. So singular noun, we want a singular pronoun and a singular verb. Plural noun, we want a plural pronoun and a plural verb. Now, again, this seems really easy, right? This is something that we've been doing from the dawn of time. However, this test likes to make it nasty. So let's talk about tips for how to do agreement. So first things first, clue. If you see an S, just the letter S, disappear between answers. That is a classic clue that we've got an agreement issue in that question. So if you see an S appear on a noun, it has gone from singular to plural. If you see an S appear on a verb, it means it has gone from plural to singular. Ooh, all right. So if you see S's disappearing, that is a classic clue for agreement. It's hard to notice because it's just one letter. So watch out for it. Now, because agreement often shows up in noun-verb agreement, right? The verb may be singular or plural. It often is paired with tense issues. So double whammy in a lot of questions. We'll have a verb that'll be in the wrong tense and the wrong number. So we have to make sure it's at the right time and the right number at the same time. So be prepared if you see verbs in your answers to do both. Now, when you are doing noun-verb agreement, be careful to match with the right noun. This is similar to what we were doing with modifiers, right? Where we wanted to make sure that the modifier matches with the right thing. It's describing the correct thing. We want to do the same thing with our verbs. Sometimes we put our verb right next to a noun, but that verb doesn't go with that noun. Sneaky, right? And so sometimes that noun is plural, and so we go, our verb is plural, but actually our verb was referring to a noun earlier in the sentence, which was singular. Let me do an example. The class of students is going on a field trip. Let me write that out. The class of students is going on a field trip. All right, taking a look at this one. Oftentimes folks go, okay, is my verb, and it's right next to students. So students is plural. That means my verb should be plural. So it should be the students are going on a field trip. That's not correct. Here, the actual noun is class of students, where of students is one of those modifiers describing class. So here it's the class is going on a field trip. Class is singular. Is singular. The sentence is right as is. All right. So be sure that you're matching your verb with the right noun. They like to try to trick you by putting fluff in the sentence, just like they did with sentence structure. So if you're not sure, think logically, cut the fluff. All right. Got a couple more tips for you. So let's continue. Be careful of singular collective nouns. So with that example, class, a lot of people go, class is a bunch of people. So the class are going. Nope, that's not right. Class is a singular noun, even though it has a lot of people in it. The company is singular, is, even though a company has a lot of people. The flock of sheep, flock is still singular, even though it has a lot of sheep in it. So it'd be the flock of sheep is large. So be careful of those collective nouns, family, choir, school, even though it has a lot of things in it. It's one. All right. And if you're going, hey, maybe some of this is review, hopefully some of this isn't, but again, a lot of people do make mistakes here. So maybe get a watch. All right. One thing that's worth noting here, and this is kind of an interesting thing. If you remember last time we were talking about how grammar evolves with time. One of the things that grammar has evolved in recent years is to use they, them as a singular pronoun, right? So oftentimes we'll say, oh, have you met the new teacher? They are really cool, right? And we would use that to talk about one person, right? And that's totally cool. But the SAT hasn't caught up with that yet. So on the SAT, they only use they and them for a plural pronoun. So that's just a thing to know about this test, is that they and them is plural here. If you want a singular noun, you're going to want to use something like one person or one teacher or he or she. Something that I think is probably going to change in the next 5 to 10 years, but on your test, just know they and them are going to be plural. All right. And then the last thing that's kind of tied to agreement is to remember humanity. If you have a person, you're going to want to use a pronoun like who or whom, something that's built for people. You're never going to call a person an it. Similarly, you're never going to describe a thing as a who. So just be careful, make human things human and non-human things not human. Okay, with that out of the way, let's go ahead and give an agreement question a shot. And if you're going, I know agreement, I'm really totally positive with this, give this question a shot, make sure you get it right. Okay, so give this a go. You want to consider both pronoun noun agreement and noun verb agreement. So A, B, C, or D in the poll. And if you don't see the poll, you can go ahead and answer in the chat, A, B, C, or D. Which one do you think has the proper agreement? Let's take about 10 more seconds. All right, closing this out in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, so the most popular answer is correct, but it is not the exclusive only answer here. So let's go ahead and talk about why the correct answer is correct. So I'm going to go ahead and take a look at the first sentence and just kind of ignore the second sentence because I don't need it for this one. So we go, the Air Jordan 11, comma, by contrast. I'm going to cut this by contrast out because it's a modifier, right? Prepositional phrase. The Air Jordan 11 look like they'd be. Now, taking a look at the answer choices, we see look versus looks, looks, and looking. Interesting. If you went ahead and just ruled out D at this point because D does not make a complete sentence, you're totally right to do that. And nobody picked D. So good call here. So we're between look and looks here. And then taking a look at the other parts of the answer choices, we've got they'd, they would, and it would. Okay, so we've got plural, plural, and singular. So the idea here is that we need to find the subject. So in the chat, what is the subject or the noun of this sentence? So what subject goes with the verb or the pronoun? Just write the subject in the chat. Yeah, okay, I'm seeing the correct one from Devaraj, which is the Air Jordan 11. And that makes sense. It's the closest thing to our verb, right? Look. So taking a look here, what do we think? Do we think the Air Jordan 11 is singular or plural? Now, I want to just shout something that I'm seeing in the chat out, and I'm sorry, I apologize to call you out, but I'm seeing Jordans, right? The subject is Jordans. And it's not. Jordans. We might say Jordans look like they'd be more fitting, but that's not what the sentence says. This sentence says the Air Jordan 11. So not a pair of Jordans, not Jordans, plural, but the Air Jordan 11, the shoe, which makes it singular. Nice job. So I'm seeing that Amani called this one out. I'm seeing Splash Plays calls this one out. I'm seeing Sean called this out. Devaraj calls this one out. It's singular. Now, a lot of people make the mistake of thinking it's plural because we'd say they're shoes. It's plural. There's two of them. Jordans are plural, but here it's singular. So we want to make sure we have a singular noun and a singular verb. A has look. Look is plural. Gone. Looks and looks, both singular. B, they is plural. Gone. C is it, singular. The answer is C. So with this question, we need to make sure that we're looking at both our subject and our verb, as well as any pronouns in the sentence. And we want to make sure we're not getting fooled by those collective nouns like the Air Jordan 11, and just assuming we know what the sentence is saying. We also saw in D, testing some sentence structure. So be careful of that. Sentence structure keeps coming up. All right, nice work. Let's go ahead and move along. Shooting through agreement quickly. All right, let's talk about possessives. So when we have nouns, sometimes those nouns own things. Now we know that possessives are not actually nouns, right? They are adjectives describing something. So in our example from yesterday, Bakila's natural racing ability, Bakila possesses that natural racing ability. Bakila's is describing the natural racing ability. Now, sometimes we have possessives as a service to sentence structure, but often we need to make sure that we are building those possessives correctly. So let's go over our rules for possessives to make sure we know them. So singular possessives, the rule is hopefully pretty clear. We add an apostrophe S. So for instance, if we have a child and that child has books, we are going to add an apostrophe S, the child's books, or the books of the child. Now, worth noting that this is true even if the word ends in S. This is a mistake that a lot of people make. So a lot of people would see, hey, the class's books, and they would go, what? That can't be right. 3 S's in a row. It's got to be the class with just an apostrophe. Books, right? Wrong. That is not true. That is not correct. That is a common misconception. When you have a singular noun, no matter if that singular noun ends in an S, you are going to add an apostrophe S. So this is correct. It looks bonkers, but it is real. So singular nouns, apostrophe S. Okay, so when do we use just an apostrophe? That's when we have plural possessives that end in an S. So for instance, if we have the class's books, here classes is plural. So because it is plural, we get just an apostrophe. All right. So it's not about whether it ends with an S. It's about the fact that it's plural and ends with an S. That's when we just do an apostrophe. Now, the only exception to this rule is if we have a plural that does not end with an S, so an irregular plural. So for instance, children is plural, but it doesn't end in an S. So because it is something that doesn't end with an S, it's going to get an apostrophe S, just like a singular. Moral of the story, we only use just an apostrophe if it is both plural and ends in an S. Any questions on that? I'm going to pause here because this is a rule that a lot of people are confused on, kind of like the colon rule. So I'm going to take a moment. And if you're good, no questions, we'll move on. Why is that the case for plural possessive? I don't know. I don't know. I think the reason is, I don't know. Actually, it doesn't make it any more clear. It's just one of those things that is just the way it is. Oh, we got a great question. How about a name that ends in an S? So an example, Jonas. Let's say Jonas has some books. Jonas, ugh, that's really ugly. Let me do text. Jonas's books. Now that might look wrong, but it is not wrong because Jonas is one person, right? Singular Jonas. And because it's singular, even though it ends with an S, it's going to get an apostrophe S. That is correct. So there is no reason to do Jonas books. That's wrong. That would never, ever, ever be right. Cool. Any questions about that? So that is a commonly misunderstood rule about possessives. Okay, now that we've got our possessive rules down, let's talk about how possessives are tested. So possessives are tested in two ways. One, is it singular or plural? So should it get an apostrophe S or just an apostrophe? All right, so we have to figure out, should it be singular or plural? But then we also have to figure out, should it be possessive at all? So sometimes we might not see a possessive at all. Sometimes we might go, okay, actually nothing is being owned by anything and it's just plural or just singular. So there's two questions, singular or plural, and is this possessive at all? Okay, let's talk tips here. So a clue for possessives is, do we have apostrophes? Pretty obvious clue. There are apostrophes in most possessives. So if you see an apostrophe, it's a possessives question. Now, because possessives are found on nouns and pronouns, they're often going to be paired with agreement issues. So what we saw on the previous page, this means that sometimes we have agreement, possessives, and tense in one sentence, in one question, but usually it's only two. So when you see possessives, make sure that you're looking out for agreement issues as well. Now, if you're trying to figure out, do we have possessives at all? A good way to figure that out is to replace the X's Y with the Y of X. So instead of going the class's books, say the books of the class. Okay, that makes sense. The class has books. Great. Or instead of saying Bakila's natural racing ability, say the natural racing ability of Bakila. That makes sense. Bakila has that natural racing ability. Teams, that would be plural. That's a great example. So for instance, if we were saying it is the teams, plural teams activity, that would be fine. The activity belongs to multiple teams. If we wrote the teams activity, that would be the activity of one team. So see how that's a difference in meaning? There we would need to judge how many teams do we have. Really great question. Okay, so if you are trying to figure out, hey, is this possessed? Go ahead and phrase it differently. So is it the activity of the teams or is it the activity of the team? And that'll help you figure it out. Okay. Last little piece of advice with possessives is to know the irregular ones. So possessed just means owned, right? So do the teams have the activity? Does the activity belong to the team? So knowing irregular ones. So here team is totally regular, but here it's versus it's, that is not regular. So here we would expect maybe the one with the apostrophe to be a possessive, but it's not. Here, IT apostrophe S is it is. And ITS, no apostrophe, that's the possessive. So a good rule of thumb is if you're choosing between a conjunction and a possessive, the one with the apostrophe is the conjunction, the one without the apostrophe is the possessive. There aren't a ton of these. It's and its are kind of the most common ones. There are two others that you might want to know. Whose versus whose. That's a good one. So who apostrophe S is who is. Whose without an apostrophe, that's the possessive. So you can know that rule about apostrophes go to conjunctions, or you can just memorize those ones because they do tend to come up. It's just a thing to know. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. Let's go ahead and try an example question. Okay. All right, so hopefully here we are noticing that some of these answers have apostrophes and some of them do not. Go ahead and give this one a go. Answer in the poll. Is the correct answer A, B, C, or D based on possessives, but maybe also based on something else? Give it a shot. Good luck. Take about 10 more seconds and answer in the poll if you can. Okay, let's go ahead and try this one together. So the most popular answer is correct, but let's go ahead and figure out why that is. So the first thing I'm noticing is that we've got nature apostrophe S, so singular nature possessive in both A and D. And then in B and C, we've got a plural nature that is not possessive. So let's go ahead and approach the possessive ones and rephrase those as the wonders of nature, right? Because that's how possessives work. The X is Y is the same thing as the Y of X. So fortunately for those who hope to preserve the wonders of nature. Oh, yeah, that totally makes sense. We are trying to preserve the wonder that is inherently in nature. I like the possessive. That makes sense to me. So I'm leaning towards A and D. But let's take a look at B and C, nature's wonders. So here we're preserving, are we preserving both natures and wonders? Are those two different things? You see how we can't understand the relationship between those words without that apostrophe, without that possessive. So, and also, why are there plural natures? That doesn't make sense. There's one nature and it has wonders. So I want it to be singular. I want it to be possessive. It's got to be either A or D. But how do I pick between A and D? Because those are my two most popular answers, but D had 3 times as many answers or 3 times as many picks as A. And that's because of this sneaky little comma right here. Another sneaky comma, right? So be so careful looking for a little S, looking for a little apostrophe, looking for a little comma, because it can make or break an answer. So here, fortunately, that's a descriptive word, so I'm just going to get rid of it. For preposition. This whole dang thing is a prepositional phrase. This whole dang thing is a modifier. When we have modifiers at the beginning of the sentence, we often want to set them off with commas. None of this opposition was fruitful is in fact an independent clause. We want to set it off with a comma to clarify that that first part is a modifier, because it's a modifier that isn't necessary for the sentence. None of this opposition was fruitful makes sense on its own. The fact that it's fortunate for people who hope to preserve nature's wonders is a little bonus. So we put in a comma to say this is extra information. It's an extra modifier, and that makes the answer D. So the difference between A and D is that it's sentence structure. It doesn't have anything to do with possessive. So again, remember that we often have questions that test multiple things at once. So you gotta know your possessives rules, but remember to fall back on Okay, now the last little thing that I want to talk about, and I know that we're at time, so I'm going to move through it really quickly, is idioms. And idioms questions are only in this lesson because there's nowhere else to put them. And the big idea with idioms is this proper English? And we talked a little bit about vocab last time, and I recommended that studying vocab isn't a good idea because you have no idea what vocab words are going to come up. Idioms are the same way. We never know what sorts of idioms are going to come up. You know, are they going to test, is it laugh at, laugh to, laugh by? Or are they going to test sit on, sit in, sit to, right? We don't know what idioms are going to come up. So these are the worst question type, but fortunately they don't come up that often. So I don't recommend studying for them. So a clue that you have an idioms question is that you can't pinpoint any other issues. You've looked and you can't find anything with punctuation or sentence structure or modifiers or parallelism or tense or agreement or blah, 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 blah. If you can't find that, but the only difference is in just a goofy little word, maybe a preposition that changes, you're likely in an idioms question. For these, I know I said rules are better than your ear, but these rules come up so infrequently that they're a really poor use of your study time. So here, you might have to use your ear with these ones. These are like vocabulary and context questions, like I mentioned earlier. Think about how you would use them in real life, but consider skipping these, right? Consider just moving past because you're not going to materialize this knowledge out of nowhere. Now, I have some examples of idioms that you might want to know. Now, I'm not going to go through each one of them just in the interest of time. So if you want to screenshot these are ones that come up relatively frequently on the SAT. So you might want to know these. But again, other idioms, there are lists of like 500 idioms. That's a really poor use of your study time. Memorizing the rules that come up often, like punctuation, and making sure that you're rock solid on your strategy for this section is going to be much more valuable than memorizing a bunch of idioms that may or may not show up on testing. Okay. I have an example question. We can do this one as a bonus at the end, but again, with idioms, this is a question where if you don't know the rule, you're struggling with it, I would recommend just circling it and coming back at the end, because again, these other questions are going to be relying on much more common rules. So bonus question for the end. Let's go ahead and do takeaways so folks can get out of here. So takeaways, writing is not reading. With reading, we are going to read the whole thing in advance, skim the whole thing. Here, we are going to answer questions as we read. We are going to remember that no change is a valid answer choice. It is just as likely to be A as it is to be any other answer. We are going to use answer choices for grammar questions. We're not going to do anything like predicting like we are on rhetoric. Here, we're going to use the answer choices to figure out the difference between the answer choices and to figure out what's being tested. Remember that rules are better than your ear. If you have rules, use them. They are going to help you to answer the question and not fall into traps from the test maker. Now, if you can't figure out what the difference is in terms of grammar, consider meaning. Meaning is everything and the whole point of grammar. And then finally, remember that simplicity is key. Simplify your sentences by taking out the fluff and pick simple answers. So here, simple answers means don't get fancy, don't add punctuation you don't need, don't use fancy tenses if you don't need them. Keep it simple, student. Okay. Now, we did not cover rhetoric. We did not cover any of these other sorts of question topics. So if you are curious about these, I recommend checking out all of our stuff on Magoosh. So I recommend maybe giving our free trial a shot, maybe trying some of our lessons on rhetoric questions, or coming to our live classes where we have a whole class that's focused on SAT writing rhetoric, as well as classes on the other sections. So again, remember, there is a 20% off code, SAT Crash 20. That is for 20% off any ACT or SAT plan. And then right now, 2, we have the opportunity to do a raffle. So if you want to stick around and find out if you got a 1-month free SAT plan for Magoosh, we're going to do that right now. But you can also go ahead and fill out our survey for the opportunity to win a $50 gift card. And if you would like to ask any questions, now is a great time. If you are not interested in the raffle, not interested in the survey, and not interested in questions, thank you for being here, and I will see you later. All right, if you got questions, throw those in the chat. And if we want to go ahead and do that raffle now, Milton, I'm ready to go. And then after that, we can also do that bonus question that I skipped over. Oh, and you should get an email about that gift card if you want it in the next few days. We're going to take a few days to just continue to collect responses, but hold tight. You should get an email in the next few days if you want. So this discount is if you are a first-time Magoosh user, but also if you are upgrading. So if you have one of our online premium accounts and you'd like to sign up for live classes, this will give you a 20% off discount from that upgrade cost. So you get a discount because you're already a student, and then you get a 20% discount. It's a pretty good deal. So no, you don't have to be a first-time user. Okay, so Sean has a question. How do we know when to begin a new paragraph on the ACT English section? So on both ACT English and SAT writing, that doesn't come up a whole ton. To be honest, whether we should break something into 2 paragraphs, we might have to put a sentence at the beginning of a paragraph or the end of a paragraph, but typically they don't ask about that very often. If they did ask about that, I would think about that. Again, it's a rhetoric question, so we'd want to think about that kind of the way we think about reading questions. There, I would think about the topics, the ideas in the paragraphs. And if you're seeing that one part of the paragraph is about one thing and another part of the paragraph is about another thing, we might want to go and pull those into 2 different paragraphs. So again, I can't really think of an example of where they would ask about that. But if they did, I would think about summaries. So is the first part of the paragraph really, really different from the second part? In that case, I would split it into 2. Hopefully that helps. Okay. Ooh, is Amani here? Amani is our winner. Woo! Is Amani still here? Hopefully. Amani, if you are here, go ahead and email Milton. Go ahead and throw an email in the chat for Amani to email to get their free account. But go ahead and email us and we'll set you up. Okay, and I'm Erika for folks asking in the chat. I'm Erika. You might see me again on YouTube. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and just skip us back to that bonus question if you'd like to give it a shot. So this is a question that has to do with idioms, but there's also some other stuff at play. So if you'd like to give this one a shot, maybe we can pop up a poll. Go ahead and give this one an answer. See how you do, and I'll explain it in a second. But while you try this one, I'm going to answer some more questions in the chat. Okay, we got a question. What are some things we need to prepare for or prep for if I'm taking the SAT tomorrow? Okay, so my big advice if you're taking the SAT tomorrow is to not cram. Make this the last thing that you do tonight that's SAT study related, except for maybe making a list of strategies. So I might recommend taking a piece of paper and making a section for reading, a section for writing, a section for math, and then maybe a section for within math for calculator and a section for no calculator. And within each of those sections, writing down the different strategies that you want to use on test day. And Amani is here. Amani, you won! So you have 1 month access to our SAT Magoosh online program, which is awesome. So that'll be a really great opportunity for you to explore maybe some of the topics that you're less familiar with, and to make sure that you're strengthening the areas that are maybe a little bit less strong for you. So go ahead and email Milton. Milton left his email in the chat, and then we'll get you hooked up with that. But congratulations, Amani. Woo, woo, woo. So back to that question. If you're taking the SAT tomorrow, making a list of strategies that you want to remember for your test day, just writing those down and kind of reviewing that before you go to sleep is a good way to make sure that when you go into your test day, those strategies don't just like fly out the window because you're stressed because you've thought about them recently. But more importantly, don't cram. Go to sleep early tonight. Make sure you eat a big breakfast. Make sure that you have all your stuff prepped in advance so that you don't have to scramble in the morning to get everything prepped. Your mental and emotional state is really important when you're going into your test, and it can make the difference between a higher or a lower score. So at this point, you're probably not going to learn a whole ton. And I know that's kind of a bummer, but before tomorrow, you want to make sure that you personally are in a really good state and that your strategies are something you're going to remember. And that's it. So don't cram tonight. Focus on strategy. Focus on making sure you're in a good place to take your test. All right, hopefully that helps. Okay, let's go ahead and talk about this question. And then I'll come back to some additional questions in the chat. So here, let's see, how did we do? The most popular answer is correct, which is awesome. So right here, I'm gonna go ahead and note that we might see whom here, and we might go, oh no, that's an idiom that I do not know. I do not know whom. What do I do with this, right? If that's the case, we can still have a really good chance of getting this one right by looking at some of the other things going on in this question. So the first thing that I might note is there are a few which, just ignoring the whom and taking a look at my other answer choices and going, wait, which? Which is something that I use for things, right? Not for people. So that doesn't really make sense. I also note this comma says the rest of this sentence is not particularly useful, right? But it actually is. If the sentence is just there are few what? I need that. So in fact, I don't want a comma here. And I know that that which thing breaks humanity. So I'm going to eliminate B. Taking a look at D, I might go that, I can't quite tell if that breaks humanity, but I do note that it adds this word a. Does that matter? It actually does. Because if I say there are few who know how they work, I'm saying there are not many people, right? There are a few who know the location of the dead man's chest, right? Okay, whoa, not a ton of people know where this is. Whoa, this is going to be hard. But if I say there are a few who know, there are a few who know, there are a few people who know that, that's actually kind of like exciting. Like, oh, some people know about this. That's really cool. So if I say there are a few, that's kind of negative. There aren't a lot of people. If I say there are a few, that's like, there's some people, yay, that's a positive tone. Here, if I take a look at the sentence, I'm saying despite the ubiquity of touch screens, despite the fact that they're everywhere, kind of a negative word, despite, there are not a lot who know how they work. I want the negative one. So a few changes the meaning of the sentence, gone. So at this point, we would need to pick between A and C. This is when we have to know the idiom because here the only difference is who versus whom. So deciding between who and whom, I'm seeing that Davis has a really incredible rule in the chat, and it's also the rule that I recommend. If you would replace the who or whom in the sentence with he, she, or they, you should use who. If you would replace the who or whom with him, her, or them, you should use whom. So taking a look here, would I say they know how they work, or he knows how they work, or she knows how they work? Or would I say him know how they work, or her know how they work, or them know how they work. I would say they know how they work, right? I would say he knows how they work. She knows how they work. Him, her, and them doesn't make sense. So because I would use he, she, or they, I should use who. So whom is not right, and the correct answer is C. Now, if you knew that, awesome, you're going to get this question right. If you did not know that, you can still eliminate B and D and then have a 50% chance of guessing right. So who and whom is one of the more common idioms. It might show up on your test day, so it's one that's not a bad idea to know. But again, idioms do not show up super often, and there's no guarantee which ones will show up, so I don't recommend memorizing a ton of them. All right, that's our bonus question. I'm going to go ahead and go back to our slide for questions. If anyone has more questions, you can go ahead and throw them in the chat. If not, see you later. All right, I'm seeing a question from Sean. Is 2 months enough to prep for the SAT? It really depends on how much you're trying to improve. So we have some guidance on this on our blog. We also, I did a webinar on setting a good study timeline. If you want to check that out, I give some guidance around like, okay, if you want to improve this many points, you need at least 1 month. If you need this many points, you need at least however many months. If you want to improve this many points, blah, blah, blah. I recommend checking that out. If you are looking for an improvement of maybe, I think the guidance was like 100 to 150 points, you might be okay in the zone of like 1 to 3 months. So 2 months might work for you. If you're looking for an improvement that is larger than that, might not be enough. So just being reasonable with your goals is a good idea, just to make sure that you're not setting a goal that you can't deliver on. So maybe, but it depends on your goals. So I recommend making sure that you know how many points you want to improve, and then deciding from there what your timeline should be. Okay, we got a question. What type of idioms appear on the SAT? So I popped up a slide a little bit earlier, which this one, if you want to give this a screenshot, these 6 idioms come up relatively frequently on the test. And by relatively frequently, I mean they might show up once, maybe. Right? So even if they do show up, they're probably only going to show up once, so not that big of a deal. But they also might not show up at all. Other idioms, again, might show up. What are some of the ones that I've seen that are weird? I've seen like effect versus affect, like once. I've seen oh man, what was one that I saw? I can't remember. There have been some weird ones that show up, but they're totally unpredictable in that way. So I don't recommend just studying like long lists of idioms in the hope that one of them shows up, because again, it's not a very common question type. I would just know that if you see an idiom, you can't pinpoint any grammatical issues, you can't pinpoint any meaning issues, just guess, because it's one question, and one question isn't going to kill your score. Don't let it eat up your time. Focus on the questions that you can get right, and then come back and try to approach it based on meaning. So what types of idioms show up? These ones are more common, but there can be other ones. Okay, I see. How often do modifiers appear on the SAT? That one's actually relatively common. So questions around modifiers are one of the more common grammatical issues. But like we saw with all of those questions, modifiers come up as part of sentence structure in like pretty much every question. They are like a critical part of grammar. And knowing that we can cut them out of sentences to cut the fluff to make that sentence easier is one of the key strategies on that section. So how important are modifiers? Like really important, even if the question isn't about modifiers. So modifiers are a big deal on SAT writing. And then one more question, lots of questions from Devaraj, which is awesome. I'm a bit weak on the reading section of the SAT. Can I give you some tips? My number one tip is watch our free SAT live class. The SAT Live class goes over some general stuff about the test at the beginning, but the second half of the class, which is like a whole hour, is just about reading passages. I really recommend checking that out. It goes over my biggest tips for getting through reading passages successfully. And then if you want my biggest tip on reading questions, I have a video on our YouTube channel where I talk about how to successfully answer questions. What's your best strategy going to be? Little hint, it is very different from your strategy for writing grammar. So with writing grammar, we use our answer choices. On reading, I really recommend not looking at the answer choices. So my biggest idea here, go ahead and check out our other videos because I talk more about passages in that live class, and I talk more about questions in that video on SAT reading. Cool. All right. If anyone has any other questions, go ahead and throw those in the chat. I'll stick around for a few more minutes and we'll wrap up. And again, there's that code SAT Crash 20. Okay, it's looking like we don't have a ton more questions, but if you do end up with a question last minute, you can always go ahead and throw that in the comments below the video. We're happy to answer there. Thanks so much for hanging out with us today and yesterday, and I'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.